The Waves of Tech is the down-to-earth tech podcast for you, your family, and your friends. We remove all the complicated, drawn-out explanations of technology and simply talk about how technology is influencing every element of our lives, from social media and the cloud to tweeting and mobile communication. We talk tech in a different way. So plug in your devices and listen as we get ready to ride the waves of tech.
On episode 436 of The Waves of Tech, a new French tax on digital internet giants, China's social credit system, and retail continuing to close stores. Find recent episodes of the podcast and connect with us on social media by heading over to thewavesoftech.com. Well, Steve, welcome in. Episode 436. How you doing tonight, man?
I'm actually doing well. It's just, first of all, it's amazing that I'm even here to be able to record the podcast after my last 4 or 5 days, with my job and some crazy things that went on. And as you and I talked about pre-show, some people just don't get it. And to be honest with you, often it is cheaper to keep up with technology than to backdraft it and try to recover from 11 years ago. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories and, for a little background. Steve, you had quite the weekend. And I know, in matter of fact, I went out to dinner the other day with my brother, your son, and we used to podcast together on this podcast itself. And he even mentioned it during dinner. It was like, man, I don't even know how Dad does it. It's like, it's dealing with some people that don't want to choose to invest in infrastructure and development and software and everything in between. It makes it really difficult for a lot of people to do their jobs correctly, and also could save a lot of headaches and a lot of stress down the road. But some people just like to defer a lot of that maintenance and infrastructure upkeep year by year, and it never makes it easy for you and for other people that are working in the IT business that are dealing with those same enterprise clients. Well, Steve, let's move on to our topics here. I found a very interesting article, and that was surfacing around probably a couple days ago, over the weekend. And this came out of Reuters. It was a report from Paris that said that a 3% tax on the French revenue of large internet companies could yield the French government around 568 million pounds, which I think is about $780 million per year. And this was according to the French finance minister. And essentially, Steve, what this is looking at is this 3% tax. I've also heard it reported at a potential 5% digital tax is really aimed at companies with worldwide digital revenue of $750 million and French revenue of about 25 million euros. He said that the tax would target some 30 companies, mostly American, but also included in that are some Chinese companies, German, Spanish, British, as well as a French firm, and several firms with at least French origins. But of course, the paper and the information that's being put out there is you obviously have Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, some of the larger digital internet giants out there right now, but it also includes the likes of Uber, Airbnb, Booking, and there's also a French online advertising specialist company that's out there that's going to be the target. And essentially what this comes down to, Steve, is as the French government was looking at the influx of today's modern technological companies and what they're doing with their digital advertising revenue and how they were making money off selling local targeted ads, how they were working within marketplaces, and how much money these companies and this revenue were making from reselling of personal data. After they did the analysis, they found out that some of the digital giants, as I just mentioned previously, some of them were paying 14% less tax than most of the European small and medium-sized businesses. And the French minister who came out and said, this is actually a matter of fiscal justice. We have a lot of the small, medium-sized companies that are obviously spurring and spawning a lot of the employment, a lot of revenue, a lot of job growth and development. They are being taxed at a higher rate and suffering the consequences, whereas you have the large companies coming from overseas, coming into France and really making a killing without having to pay a commission or any sort of tax on their business earnings. And they did outline that there's going to be some exemptions for some of the companies, some within the digital advertising space and some of the website resellers. But at the same time, they're looking at the large companies, Steve, here that are really making a killing, like I said, off these local targeted ads that are making a lot of money on reselling of personal data. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is we know that for a fact, a lot of these American-based companies that have sort of infiltrated the European area, that even the European Union has levied millions and millions, if not billions of dollars in fines to a lot of the American-based companies. And the European Union is really taking a staunch stance against a lot of these companies. Now you're seeing the individual countries of France and the governments really saying, okay, now is the time where we intend to tax your revenue so that it's a more equitable standing for so many companies within at least our government purview. So I wanted to sort of set that stage there, Steve, and then get your sort of comments and feel on what's going on here. It seems like it was inevitable with what's been going on over there in the European Union and the European nations. But again, Spain and the UK have been working on digital sales tax for a while now. Haven't really got over that hurdle yet, but it's something that they're really looking forward to doing.
Dave, let's just say welcome to the digital world once again. It's the way business is being done. I'm not saying that the stripping off of personal information should be used for various kinds of things to include targeted ads, but it is part of the methodology that is used today. And certainly any identity that can figure out a way to tax something or create a revenue stream off of something, they're going to attempt to do it. I get it, but I guess I have a thing of strictly targeting certain venues or tech companies when there are certainly other avenues, other companies that do similar things, but perhaps are not on the scale as some of these bigger ones. That all has an impact and effect to how we use our digital tools today. How far do you go before these companies say, sorry, we're just not going to service your country anymore? And then what kind of impact is that to them? And to some degree, I guess I couldn't blame them for doing so. Will they probably pull out because of something like that? No, but it is a concern. And I guess the other concern I would have, Dave, is just an overall census of how do we in this world, since we're so interconnected now, deal with all the individualisms of countries, counties, cities, states that come up with their own determinations of what is good, what is bad, what is taxable, what is not taxable on a global scale to really make this, number one, fair to everybody, but really know that there is some kind of a level playing field out there with a standard of how this is to work.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's tricky. And I guess my statement to that would be, if you take tech corporations out of it, if you're looking at any other business model in any other industry, I think if you throw in tech into the conversation now, they've always worked on understanding that different municipalities, different governments, whether it's a state, local, at a federal level, whatever, it's a European Union, there are going to be individual rules that you have to play by, and that hasn't prevented any company like Amazon, Facebook, or Twitter, or Airbnb, Uber, of infiltrating, getting into these marketplaces, because they know in order to earn a significant amount of profits and to please our shareholders and our stakeholders within our company, we have to abide by those rules. If the companies didn't want to be there in the first place, they wouldn't be there. I always think of, those little e-scooters we've talked about quite a bit. When they dropped here in Bakersfield, we had no rhyme or reason or anything on the books to say how you were supposed to operate within our city. The Bird executives or their management met with the city and they put some frameworks around them. Now we have a second corporation that's realizing, okay, it's profitable to be in Bakersfield with these e-scooters. Now we're going to work within their frame. And that's going to be different whether you're in San Francisco, Santa Monica, Atlanta, New Jersey, New York, wherever it is. And so I think these large internet giants that they're really targeting, they know they have a lot of money to be made. And with them sort of outshining and making more money than a lot of those small and medium, I think they're just trying to level the playing field so that there's fair business practices that are going on. Everybody's essentially being equitable and sharing that wealth accordingly. And I'm not so concerned about them having to follow these rules, because Spain obviously has something very different than the UK versus France and the US. And so I think that's just part of operating these giant, large international organizations now, Steve. And I guess it's a little bit different. I thought a lot of these companies were already paying a lot of taxes, but in my small little brain, I didn't think outside of like how the Chinese government or the European governments really charge and how do they generate revenues for taxes to serve their residents. Some of these companies don't have digital advertising as a taxable, activity? Or how are these marketplaces managed? How, when you resell personal data, that isn't in the tax code. That's not part of, the normal routine of how governments and sometimes these tax revenue entities work. So I think this is just more of like an adjustment, a tweak to how things are being done. And I think it's a very equitable move to make. It's just surprising that it's taken this long.
Certainly, I don't have any issues at all, Dave, of if there is a transaction of a product that, there's a taxable portion of that. I guess what strikes me strange, and maybe I didn't spell this out correctly in the beginning, is when it comes to, in some of these examples, the taxation of advertisement. To me, that just seems odd, kind of weird. You're making assumptions that they're making money on that. I don't know. I don't know how you actually quantify what they're doing with relationships to advertisement in the taxability of that. I guess I just find that really odd or strange.
Yeah, I think what they're looking at is probably the companies, i.e. the large ones that I mentioned at the top of the show, as they're implementing local targeted ads, marketplaces, reselling of data. I don't think they're looking at those individually to sort of evaluate any sort of value that they can get from it or any sort of revenue source. They're looking at companies that make upwards of $750 million within France as revenue based on sort of their models. And so I don't think it's like a individual sort of, unit by unit that they're looking at. It's more just at a global level. If they make X amount of dollars and they have this sort of business model, this is how we're going to tax them moving forward. And let's be honest. I mean, a lot of these companies are already paying large amounts, but levying another 3% on top of that probably isn't going to hurt them much. And as you see a lot of the growth in Uber and Airbnb, Facebook, Apple, Google, all of them, I mean, they're constantly saying that, hey, we're earning more and more clients and we're selling more and more products. And I think France is just trying to position themselves to at least seek some of the benefits of those companies operating within their country limits.
How about if we just tell countries to stay out of our business, that we're being taxed enough? How's that?
Oh, I don't know. That's tough.
It probably wouldn't fly, would it?
Yeah, it probably wouldn't fly.
It probably wouldn't fly.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It becomes a little, at least from my perspective, a little overwhelming that we have all these individual intricacies out there of how the web, not necessarily just the web, but how internet infrastructure is to be sold and taxed, I guess in itself is a whole discussion on a worldwide level that's, I guess, pretty interesting to really uncover and discuss.
It's true. Yeah, it's a very layered system with, like you said, several intricacies. I guess you can take it back to even the net neutrality conversation that goes here in the US is if you have 50 states with individual net neutrality rules and there's no real common practices set at a federal level, that really complicates things for ISPs and it complicates things for the residents having to understand nuances within their state and what they're allowed to report, what they can ask ISPs to collect and not collect. And there's a number of nuances, I think, with so many things within the tech industry because it is such, I guess, Steve, we are still in this sort of foraging forward mentality and we're trying to figure things out, both from like innovation and getting eyes on your product and platform to also governments figuring out, okay, we want these companies to succeed. We want them to invest in education and infrastructure and development and products so that our people can buy it. But at the same time, how do we regulate that and how do we at least seek some revenue off that so we can fund things like the FCC and the FTC and SEC and those different organizations? So you're right, man. It's a very layered approach. We only have one little podcast that can kind of dissect it 10 minutes at a time or 15 minutes at a time. But, every minute counts and every thought goes into consideration.
Well, perhaps since Al Gore invented the internet, he can tell us how to fix this situation.
He could. That's a good idea. We'll get him on here.
But it brings up something that every country is a little unique, a little different, and to in fact state that how much tax did Amazon pay the U.S. government last year? 0. And it's because of loopholes and all kinds of things that go on where the net exchange was 0. So I guess if you can suck money out of them, why not go do it?
It's pretty crazy. Well, speaking of weird things in countries, Steve, that we may not understand, but I think warrants a discussion here on the podcast. And first and foremost, I want to say I had no idea this was going on in China right now. And I came across a very interesting article that piqued my interest from The Verge, and it was called "China Banned Millions of People with Poor Social Credit from Transportation in 2018. And Steve, my head went spinning when I read that article. And all of a sudden they started talking about the Chinese social credit system and how this system has been set up since 2014 and it's going into full implementation by 2020. And essentially what this system does, it rates how valuable you are as a human, where every individual citizen is based on their citizen score. It tells you what people can and cannot do based on that rating system. And Steve, I don't know if you've ever heard of that. This is the first time I've ever heard about it.
I have not heard about it. And, when we were talking in the pre-show, you mentioned about this and I go, what? That kind of thing exists? And as you stated to me, we in the United States find something like that very odd, very strange, very wrong. To classify people that have a poor social credit is really an interesting phraseology when it comes to that. I think of that in a certain connotation, and I'm sure the Chinese don't look at it this way, but to score, I guess I would say, my social abilities is beyond comprehension to me, Dave.
Exactly, and I think that's where I'm at. And to put a little context around this, I don't know if anybody out there who's listening now has watched Black Mirror. They had a episode simply based on this whole social credit scoring system, and that you were allowed or not allowed to rent vehicles, and you were allowed or not allowed to rent hotel rooms based on interactions you had with individuals. So if you went into a coffee shop, this is all the Black Mirror episode, and you had a good interaction with whoever was making your coffee or served you food, they would rate you and you would rate them. And so everybody was vying for this best possible credit score because it meant you got things in the future. So with that context, that's exactly what this social credit system is doing in China. And a little bit more context here is that China is slowly becoming more of a 100% police state, where the government of China is controlling every aspect of data collection, controlling every element of travel, all those things. And we'll have a couple links in the show note that dive into that a little bit more. But what this is doing, Steve, is that the citizen score comes from monitoring. So the federal government is monitoring on a regular basis an individual's social behavior. And what they classify and put in that are a few things. I'm not going to go into an entire list, but what they do is they evaluate and score you based on your spending habits. They can evaluate and score you on how regularly you pay your bills. They can rate you on social interactions, say when you come and go from checkpoints within the state. They rank you, and it all becomes a basis for someone's trustworthiness, so essentially their public ranking. This absolutely, in fact, affects a Chinese citizen's eligibility when it comes to a number of services, including what kind of jobs you can get, what kind of mortgages you can be offered. It can often impact the schools that your children are now qualified to attend. And so, Steve, it's really this very dystopian sort of view of society, but it's turning into a service that the Chinese governments are going to be using, and it's not going to be voluntary. Right now, since 2014, they rolled out a voluntary implementation. They partnered with a number of private technological companies, and they ironed out a lot of the algorithms, a lot of how they were going to, scale down all the large sets of data that they were going to be given. It's incredible. And what has turned out is that in 2018, at least 23 million times, they banned somebody from buying plane tickets or train tickets to travel either within or outside the boundaries of the Chinese state. And Steve, I don't know exactly where to go with this conversation other than it is beyond my comprehension. I can't imagine something like this happening in any other country other than more of the police state and police mentality that the federal or with the Chinese government is really putting forward here. But I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to control behavior to some extent with a lot of positive or negative reinforcement, as I said, based on the type of jobs and mortgages and schools you can attend. And there's a number of reasons they've set it up. But at the same time, this is very intrusive, and it essentially comes to the point where if you're not on your best behavior, you can't control what you do, where you go, how you do it, and even places as far as where you can eat, where you can buy vehicles, or where you can drink your coffee. And so it is incredibly weird, Steve, that by 2020, they're going to have a file on every Chinese citizen that includes all the data collected on their behavior. It's going to be publicly available, and it's going to be involved fingerprints and biometric information, and the list goes on. And it is so bizarre to think about, Steve, but there's going to be a database that has 1.3 billion people with their information, and the Chinese government is going to be able to control what those people can buy, where they can go, what they can and cannot do.
I think if you look throughout history, and governments that have attempted to, quote, control the public have honestly, in the end, not succeeded, because attempting to control leads to no control. As they continue to go through this process, to be tagged with a citizen score, and what do you do? Put it on their forehead. He's only a 9 out of 10, or do you carry an ID card that says my citizen score is 3.2?
Yeah, there's an app for that.
Yeah, there probably is,
yeah.
Right? Certainly, I think for the people living there might have an idea, but for the most part, think this is normal, that this is the way of life throughout the world, because there is kind of a closure to outside information that we have here in the Western world that really counteracts that kind of philosophy, that kind of indulgence into something I think is crude. I guess we see where it goes from here. Why you would want to control that, I guess, is something that they have decided to embark upon, because it gives them that big brother attitude. It gives them that big brother confinement of people to put their arms around to say, here's how you are governed. Here's how you will live your life. Here are your do's and don'ts. You have no desires because your citizen score is crapola. I don't get it, Dave.
Yeah, it's crazy. And there's I was doing a little bit more research, and I was looking at some of the comments, pretty much like anti this social credit system and scoring system. And, some of these data points, depending on what the Chinese government decides to track and model and put within their algorithm, it said a few of these data points could paint a very inaccurate and incomplete picture of a person. And I have to agree with this individual. He said, quote, you may be playing games for 10 hours, and if the algorithm says you're idle, it might miss the reason you're playing these games. He says maybe you're an engineer and you're beta testing them. Now you're automatically designated as an idle person, when in reality, maybe you're just doing your job. And unfortunately, doing your job may have a negative impact on your scoring system. And also, Steve, one other really good comment he made here was he said, quote, in the free world, this will never catch on, right? This is going to be a very Chinese-specific implementation because of their government structure and the way they've set up their citizenship there. It says if they're naive enough to roll it out, he believes it's actually going to harm China's credibility on a regional and also really harm its credibility on a global scale. He says a lot of tech companies working in China are already growing heavily frustrated due to the intense restrictions when it comes to a lot of the technological policies, a lot of the encryption that the Chinese government requires. And he believes with these tech companies, it's only going to add to their level of frustration in dealing with that, government infrastructure there. So it's an incredible story, Steve. Again, I had no idea there was an actual scoring system, because when I watched that Black Mirror, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's no way this is happening. And my wife and I said to ourselves, at some point we're going to get close and this is going to happen. But to me, it's a complete shock to think that you can use all the modern technology in the world with algorithms and data collection and spin that into a complete controlling mechanism on determining how your citizens travel, where they eat, where their kids can go to school, what kind of cars you can buy, what kind of houses you can own, how you can pay for that home and that house. Utter chaos, Steve, in my head to even think about this, but I had to share it with on this podcast because I thought it was just something that I would have never seen, and it's been going on for 5 years, and I had no clue whatsoever.
See, this could be one of those items that could be considered fake news or internet folklore or whatever the case, but it's not, because we have validated this through different sources, and it appears to be very legit. I guess I'm even kind of surprised that this kind of story even gets out knowing the way that the Chinese government really controls every aspect of information.
A lot of censorship, exactly. And I found this article from The Verge, and I started clicking some of their links to stuff that was happening in 2016 and 2015. And as I kind of just dove down into this pit of, just Google Chinese scoring credit system or social credit system, and you're going to find a host of different articles and a lot of reactions and a lot of information on this. And it's just been incredible, Steve, how, you can really lock in your citizen base and really control what you're doing 24/7.
It really makes you appreciate the life you live and the places you live, right? You don't have to be under those kind of scrutinies, those kinds of oversight that we here in many of the free world certainly love and enjoy. Dave, periodically we talk about so-and-so of a store is closing stores or going out of business or whatever the case may be. And the estimates right now for 2019, there's going to be over 4,000 stores closing just in the United States that are brick and mortar type. And so many times when you hear about this stuff or a store closing or going out of business, it's, because of Amazon. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, Dave, in just a moment. Some of the real scalps that are going to be taken in 2019, a lot of us have heard about Payless shoe store, totally going out of business, 2,500 stores. There's many others when we talk about Sears and Kmart and some Lowe's stores closing, Macy's, Kohl's, Nordstrom's. JCPenney is in a world of hurt, and it's not on my current list, but even Starbucks is considering closing 150 stores. So let's take a thought about this, because as we continue to see this unraveling, people are all talking and assuming it's because of online commerce. And I'm here to say that it has a part to do with it, but it's not the entire picture, because the entire picture really has many components, and a lot of those components are different from each of these operating businesses. It could be that your stores and your product just suck now. You haven't caught up. It could be a financial issue because of mismanagement. It could be because of poor Wall Street expectations. It could be because of business locations, property locations. I think we are too quick to point that online commerce is the cause. A lot of these companies, in fact, let's take Target, for example, and Walmart, are really moving hard for an online presence to combat the 800-pound gorilla Amazon. That's fine and good, because there needs to be that competitive nature within. The second part that I want to say with this, Dave, is we can't have all the brick and mortar closed. We have to have them as a part of a survival mechanism. Whether it's groceries or, hey, I can't buy this widget at xyz.com. I need to really go to Lowe's to look for this item and make sure it measures out right, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of passive and active responses, I think, when we talk to online retailing versus closures of many stores. I think for many of these brick and mortar places, it's just been bad management and bad financial planning over time and not keeping up, quote, with the Joneses. That's kind of my pick with it, but we're still going to lose about 4,000 stores this year.
Yeah, I appreciate a fresh look on retail stores closing, Steve. I really like your opinions on where you're going with this, because it is. I think Amazon, online shopping, Walmart's, anything sort of the large brick and mortar stores that have taken over a large presence within a lot of the smaller communities and, have really, as you mentioned, Target really trying to push that online presence. I think it's an easy scapegoat. It absolutely is. It's easy to say, well, people aren't going out to the stores. People aren't doing this and that. Well, Steve, I got to tell you, every time I go out shopping, there are just as many people out shopping in the stores as I remember 5 years ago, 10 years ago, before online shopping hit. Yes, is it a lot more convenient? Absolutely. Has it taken a lot of foot traffic away from the likes of Best Buy, Payless, a lot of these stores? Absolutely. You can look at Sears. They've been struggling for years. JCPenney has been struggling for years. But Steve, to your point, it's not only because of online shopping. It's not because the 800-pound gorilla is Amazon. It is from a lot of poor management, from expanding too quickly. We've seen that with Starbucks, where they've already scaled back like 500 stores over the last 3 years because they realized there was too much of them and their demand was slipping because of it. And they just grew too fast, and Howard Schultz and that executive committee looked and said, we need to readjust how we look at our business model. And I think that's what exactly Nordstrom, Kohl's, JCPenney, Macy's, you can throw in Charlotte Russe, Gymboree, Sears, any of the other listed stores that are going to be closing here, and you can really look at mismanagement, whether they chose to expand in a retail space before expanding online, whether they just got into a bad financial situation where they had really good leases or they had really good construction costs and they just built new store after new store. But you're even looking at the Home Depots, Lowe's. It's just a different dynamic in the newer economic functions that we're in. And so you're right. Or Wall Street expectations, putting too much invested in brick and mortar, making a lot of those bad structural financial decisions, leveraging a lot of debt versus your profit margins. That is a huge thing that really suffered, like the likes of Kmart and Sears. And Steve, I think we underestimate all those reasonings when it comes to these retail stores closing. And with the exception of the outliers like Payless, Gymboree, and Shopko, most of these are dwindling down, 25, 50, 60 stores. They're not doing the massive sell-off like the Payless shoes of 2,500 here in Canada and the United States. So I think you really have to look at a lot of the history behind a lot of these corporations and say, maybe it's not online shopping that's killing it. Maybe it's a lot of structural and financial of inefficiencies and deficits that they've created over the years, and maybe add in some flavor to say that perhaps they haven't adjusted quickly enough to the online space, and that is maybe accentuating what's been going on in this space. But I really like your approach that, it's a scapegoat, it's easy, it's part of the equation, but it's just not Amazon, it's just not and it's not just online shopping.
Let's take Payless for an example. I think that's a good example, because I used to have one in the town I live in here, and now it's a pizza joint. They are totally going out of business. Yes, there are companies like Zappos and some of those places where you can actually buy footwear online. To me, it's not something I would ever do. I would want to honestly try it on before I bought. But me personally, in the case of Payless, I think their shoes just suck, and that's why they're going out of business. Their product sucked. I mean, I didn't find ever great assortment, great quality, and those kinds of things. In today's world, if you're going to pay a pretty penny of your hard-earned money for something, you want some good quality for a good price. And I don't think they really delivered on that. And that's the reason. It's not because Zappos took all the shoes away from everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. Steve, we went to Payless shoe stores growing up. That's where I got my 4 new pair of shoes or 2 new pair of shoes for the year. And that's where I went. And at the time, they were discounted. They were perfect for the price range we were looking for, but they stood up for a while. And that is a big reason why companies go out of business, is because their product, their quality of their production, their manufacturing, the overall quality of their product slips. You can get by for a while if you have an average product with excellent customer service, excellent availability. But once people start realizing that, okay, I spent $40 on shoes and these lasted me 3 months, or I paid $50 for whatever, and all of a sudden in a couple months, they're starting to fall apart and I have to go get something else. Or I'm paying $25 and they're just not comfortable, because we have to also remember that a lot of this is fashion based. And so perhaps your decisions where you cut comfort costs came at the expense of closing all your stores. And so, Steve, I think you're exactly right. You have to look at quality of the product. Really, when you start lessening that, and you've seen that with Kohl's and you've seen that with Kmart as a perfect example. When was the last time somebody went into Kmart and said, man, this is a good quality t-shirt. This is a good quality pair of jeans. It's not there anymore, and not specifically like the Levies brand, but what Kmart has decided to produce on their own, or the brands they've decided to bring in as third-party sellers. So I think you're on to something even more there, Steve. You can look at this in several layers and say, your products have got to be stellar. They have got to stand up over time. People have to feel like they're getting money and good value for what they're spending.
it brings up an interesting point in that if you look at this small list that we do have, majority of it is apparel, clothing, accessories, and those kinds of things. And I could potentially see those getting in trouble with some of the alternatives they're around, i.e. slash their price point for some of that material.
Steve, when you look at apparel and you look at the fashion industry, your profit margins are already very slim. You're not expected to make 30, 40% off of your ticket prices for what you're selling. I mean, we're talking about profit margins within the likes of clothing and apparel of anywhere from 5% to 8%, maybe at 10 if you're lucky. And that's if you're pushing product and you have really good, customer support and you're really pushing the fashion trends and you're up on it. But your profit margins within fashion are relatively low. I mean, you can look at any tech corporation that is selling stuff online, even Target, they have a much higher profit margin than that. So unless you're really looking at that, you're going to have a really hard time being successful in today's, at least, economic marketplace.
Yeah, because, looking at just this list, and I know these kind of places go out of business, but I don't see any restaurants on this list, okay? Restaurants have a tight margin, but I think it is a necessity of eating, and we enjoy going out to eat, and we'll spend an extra amount of money to enjoy a meal at a place than to go to a JCPenney and, pay for a certain kind of a product. I think there's a big distinction that I'm starting to see between apparel line stores and other types of brick and mortar.
Well, Steve, let's dive into our final topic here, and we're just going to briefly mention some of the upcoming events and little coverage that we're going to be doing over the next month or so. So next week, I'm going to be heading out to Q, which is Computer User Educators, and this is the same event I went to last year, and it was a 3-day conference, which is all about education, all about integrating technology, and it's a 3-day event where they take over the city of Palm Springs, and Steve, it's like 8,000 educators swarming the streets of this small little resort town in the desert of California, and it's a blast. I'm going to have our recording gear. I'm going to be interviewing some of the presenters. I'm going to interview, again, some of the vendors and exhibitors there with a lot of the cool products that are going to be out there, and maybe some of the new stuff coming in 2019 and 2020 within the educational space. And of course, I'm going to catch up with a few podcasters and a few friends while I'm out there. So I'm going to be heading out to Q, Steve, again this year, grabbing some interviews, putting that together for an episode. Really looking forward to that. And also, I'll be on social media sharing things as I go, as I cover that event as press.
It's always a good adventure when you're out there recording some of this information. I think we've done it for a couple years now where we collectively get some of these interviews at some of these places. And, it's interesting stuff. I find it amazing what people are doing within STEM and things like that. And then I think in April, we may cover parts of NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters out of Las Vegas. And then in August, looks like Podcast Movement out of Florida. And then, of course, we will finish our year off in September, Dave, with International Podcast Day. So in between there, we still have our normal shows, but, we got some big events coming up too.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I always enjoy attending these events. I enjoy reporting on them. More importantly, I like getting boots on the ground, talking to people, finding out what they're doing, whether it's in the podcasting space, the educational space, whatever's happening in technology, we want to go there. We want to check it out. Steve, you and I have been up to Fresno a couple times to see what's going on in the Central Valley of California. And I think that's a really cool event to cover. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to not only attending ourselves, Steve, but also getting some good information passed along to you as a listener out there, hoping to change, some of your perceptions, and maybe even just if you're within the educational space or podcasting space, you can learn something new along the way. So I'm really looking forward to our upcoming events and coverage throughout the rest of the year.
I am too. But for today, that wraps up this episode of The Ways of Tech, Dave, and kind of interesting discussion this week when we talk about, to us, foreign countries, and the way that they view various components of whether it's technology or people or the big hand over the little guy that I've heard quoted before. And it's interesting how the technology aspect, regardless, even gets involved with the human aspect of monitoring, tracking, and scoring of humans.
Yeah, a pretty incredible state, Steve, in which we live in right now. So if anybody has any experience or knowledge about the French taxation, or if anybody has been involved or is part of the social credit system that's expats out there in China and you have some information to pass along to us, just head over to our website. We'd love to get a little detail, a little bit of inside information on your experience or any of your insight on what's going on. So we appreciate everybody for coming out and hanging out with us again. To find recent episodes of the podcast and connect with us on social media, once again, head over to thewavesoftech.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to keep on teching.